Thank you, Madam Speaker. And if the gentleman from Texas would mind lingering in the chamber for just a moment, I want to make a couple of comments on what he said, because he began his talk with commemoration of some extraordinary Americans, World War II veterans. And as I was waiting my turn to speak, I couldn't help but reflect upon perhaps one of the most extraordinary opportunities that I've been given as a member of the House of Representatives. A bipartisan delegation went to the 70th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And President Obama, of course, spoke, and dignitaries from around the world, including the Queen of England, also made an appearance. But when we got to the area, to the cemetery area at Omaha Beach, meeting veterans who had fought there or in the vicinity. And one of the first gentlemen I met, he had only a thumb, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. And I just asked him, because it was such a celebratory atmosphere, and everyone was so engaged by the heroism of these men and the opportunity to be back so many years later. I just asked him, I said, "Did that happen here?" He said, "Yeah, right over there on the beach." Well, his daughter was with him, and she told me a moment later, she said, actually what happened was, we think that he was shot on the hip, and one of his grenades began to go off, and he was throwing it away from himself. I looked at him, I said, "How are you here?" He said, "I don't know." Another man had been a part of the paratroopers who dropped in behind enemy lines the night before near a town of Saint-Mary-Église, and I'll come to that town in a moment. And I asked him, I said, what was your assignment? He said, Hill 60 or some number. And I said, "Where's that?" He said, "Right over there." He said, "Guard the bridge at Lafayette." I said, "That's the bridge at Lafayette." An old Norman-style arched stone bridge, maybe a car length wide, obviously just one lane to get a horse and cart over. He said, "Do not let the Germans cross that bridge," and that was our assignment, and we held them. Another man looked at me, he said, "I haven't been here in 70 years. Much better reception this time." This great humor, this depth of character that these extraordinary men showed was so evident that day. And to continue the story a little bit more, Captain Luther Sexton Fortenberry, my grandfather, left his family in August of 1944. And he was initially in a hospital. He was a medical doctor. And he was initially in a hospital in England, and the records are a bit unclear. But in November of 44, he was killed. And he left his 8-year-old son, my father, behind. He was initially buried at Saint-Mary-Église, the cemetery there. Now he's reinterred in Arlington National Cemetery. One of the guides that we had with us that night, or during that trip, excuse me, was a former British military officer, and he had a complete command of the details of the battle. In fact, I was so impressed by him, I invited him to come to Nebraska to speak to my veterans, and he accepted. So the summer after, later that summer, we hosted him in Nebraska, and one of my little towns is called Columbus, Nebraska. Columbus is actually where the place where Andrew Jackson Higgins was born, the Higgins boat inventor, the troop carrier that landed there in Omaha and Utah Beach that day. It was President Eisenhower said of Andrew Jackson Higgins, he won the war for us. But he's very much associated with Louisiana, because that's where he spent his adulthood in shipbuilding, and he would not let go of the idea that we needed this innovative type of troop carrier. But he is from Columbus, Nebraska. In the front of Columbus, Nebraska, a small agricultural town, wonderful community, 25,000 people, they've built an extraordinary World War II memorial that is a replica of the Higgins boat with beautiful bronze sculptures of the troops charging off that boat. When my friend, the former British military officer who now does, again, tours and commentary on the battle, saw this, he looked at me and said, "Jeff, this belongs on Utah Beach, because there's nothing like that there anymore." Well, I'll make a long story short. Some of the members of the community who had worked on that project heard this. They said, "Well, we can build another one." And I was trying to tap down expectations because I knew how difficult that would be. But the day before the 70th anniversary, that new World War II memorial was put in the breach where our troops first came through, where General Roosevelt led our troops through on Utah Beach, right in the breach. A memorial constructed by the good people of Columbus, Nebraska, now sits as a permanent display, a replica of the Higgins boat, right next to the World War II Museum right there on Utah Beach. I understand it's extraordinarily popular as you're able to enter into the boat and experience the lifelike reality of what it must have been like to be in that moment. The French even moved one of their own monuments, by the way. This is the cooperation we had with the French government. They moved their own monument to General Leclerc, their general who had followed the pathway or fought as well on into Germany. So I apologize for holding you up, but you know, you talked about a number of things, and obviously we're going to have big, important debates about a number of the sensitive points you talked about. But where there is no debate is the character of the men and women who served in World War II. So thank you so much. Now, Madam Speaker, I wanted to give this commentary tonight as well on some of the dynamics of the moment. But before I begin, I'd like to share with you that outside of my office, it hangs a framed copy of a piece of legislation. In fact, it was the first piece of legislation that one of the earliest pieces that I worked on here, and I'm quite proud of it. What the bill did was it increased the number of Iraqi translators who could come to the United States. Now, these persons, they served alongside our troops, putting themselves and their families at great personal risk in service to our country. And among those who benefited from this expanded policy were members of the Yazidi faith tradition, a peaceful faith that very sadly ISIS has targeted as a part of their extermination campaign against Christians and other religious minorities, including innocent Muslim communities. Madam Speaker, as we all know, America has long opened her arms to persons fleeing persecution who wish to rebuild their lives and become good citizens here. My hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska is a diverse, welcoming community with a number of first-generation Americans, and we are the better for it. However, when there is chaos and disorder at our border, or there is uncertainty in immigration policy and procedures, this problem undermines the ability of our country to be generous, or worse, it affects our safety. So there are two principles being held in the balance here: keeping America safe and keeping America generous. President Trump's executive order protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry to the United States, it suspended all new refugee admissions into the U.S. for 120 days. And in addition, it blocks all travelers for 90 days from 7 countries of concern: Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, which was a list, by the way, created by the Obama administration in 2015. Refugees from Syria are banned indefinitely. Travelers from these countries with a green card will be allowed since they are permanent United States residents. Now, Madam Speaker, from my perspective, I believe it is reasonable to pause and review our refugee policy from dangerous parts of the world. But clearly, the implementation of the policy has caused some confusion and concern, some of which has been clarified. But as an example, there's a Yazidi man named Nawaf who was one of those military translators, again, putting himself at great risk to serve alongside our troops. Nawaf visited my office last Monday night. It was in the evening. He requested help for his wife, Layla. 2 of his brothers live where I live, in Lincoln, Nebraska. And although I didn't recognize him at first, I remembered that a president of a university in Iraq, whom I know, he once told me about a Yazidi student who had become class valedictorian of that university. So I began to piece this story together. Then Nawaf arrived in America just last year. Following 18 months of vetting, his wife was awarded a special visa about a week and a half ago. But as Nawaf was explaining to me, both with great composure and, frankly, a certain sensitivity to our security concerns. He told me that his wife, Layla, was barred from entry. Madam Speaker, immigration and refugee policy, it always involves difficult choice. A country has to consider, first, its absorption capacity, the possibilities of assimilation, as well as the necessity of those coming to accept the values of the host country. Now, I think a review of this policy or these principles, a review of what's happened in Europe, actually sheds some light. For example, Germany recklessly threw open its borders recently, and a wave of persons, many young single men, entered the country, sparking an uptick in crime and violence, and possibly the conditions for more terrorist attacks. Confusion continues as to who is where, and this German government's rapidly considered and naive refugee policy has unwittingly created an anti-immigration backlash and political turmoil. Madam Speaker, immigration and refugee movement should always be a means of last resort. Everyone can't come to the West. Rather, it is the responsibility of governments around the world to create the conditions in which people can live securely. And if that breaks down, as a first-order response, robust humanitarian assistance and repositioning persons in nearby safe zones creates the possibility of a right of return and avoids the trauma of uprooting persons from their home and their culture. Madam Speaker, with all the complex considerations surrounding immigration, though, it is important to remember that we are not dealing with statistics. We are not dealing with some remote geopolitical policy, but we are dealing with the lives of real persons. So happily, last Friday morning, after my office successfully worked on the case, Layla arrived, and with open arms and flowers, Nawaf, her husband, welcomed her to America. Madam Speaker, given now that the executive order has been halted, put on a temporary halt, as the administration goes through a appeal process, I'd also think it's appropriate to pause and speak about the broader issues at stake here. What it means to be a nation and what it means to have a binding narrative as a people. Madam Speaker, I'm quite sure our soldiers know this feeling all too well. I've experienced it. Perhaps you've experienced it too. You're in a far-off place with no one familiar around you, and then you all of a sudden have that feeling of connection because you see it. You see an American flag. And at that moment, the flag is more than a piece of cloth with stars and stripes. It is an enduring symbol that expresses a deep, unspoken narrative about who we are as a people and about the ideals that unite us as a nation. If you ask most people what America means, I would suggest that they would probably use one word: freedom. Yet I'm afraid, Madam Speaker, that this word freedom is so overused that we've forgotten its essential meaning. Most properly understood, freedom is the ability to do what one ought, to take responsibility for oneself, one's family, one's community, and by extension, one's nation. Freedom is not a detachment from responsibility to do whatever you want. That is a destructive, self-destructive idea that erodes freedom, resulting not only in the loss of oneself, but in the degradation of the entire community. And of course, we often reflect on what it means to be an American when discussing immigration. America has long offered the hope of freedom for immigrants yearning to work for a better future for themselves, for their families, to those tempest-tossed, to those tired, poor world masses yearning to be free, America has lifted its lamp beside the golden door. And implicit in this worldwide welcome was a basic compact that those who came here, however arduous their journey, must undertake the responsibilities of citizenship. And of course, many people gleefully do. But in fact, America's very survival as a beacon-handed land requires those who immigrate to assimilate and to adopt the values proposition that makes our country unique in the history of the world. Those values include respect for others, acceptance of law and order as a prerequisite for the orderly functioning of society, and the desire to participate constructively as a citizen. Those who refuse to assimilate or reject these time-honored values take advantage of the sacrifices and hard-fought gains of generations of Americans who have built and often died for what we cherish and what we so eagerly share with people from around the world. That's fundamentally unfair and an abuse of the idea of freedom itself. Madam Speaker, freedom, individual freedom, is achieved most fully in the context of community. And when the government or interest groups see freedom merely as a functional meeting of material needs alone, it undermines the social dimensions of freedom, which are rooted in authentic human relationship. Conversely, the proper amount of government, a government well ordered, provides protection and creates the guardrails for individuals to flourish together, generating meaning for persons and community. The right political approach in America can restore that golden mean. Madam Speaker, there's a story I'd like to tell. It's of a man. He's talking to his young son, and he said, "Son, you see that beautiful, lovely home there on the hill? One day, if it's your heart's desire, and if you are willing to work hard and be patient, if you do what's right, then maybe you could earn that home one day." Another man in another country took a very different approach. Talking to his young son, he said, "See that big mansion on the hill there? If you work hard enough, if you stay focused, and if you position yourself right, one day you can get that guy." You see, Madam Speaker, our country is not based on the principle of envy. It is based on respect and responsibility. To make America flourish again, politically, economically, and culturally, a restoration of this ideal is necessary to create the conditions for true and lasting freedom.